You probably know me. I'm Josh Jordan. I'm the director of the Making Studio here at GSAPP. And my real job today is to introduce our guest speakers via introducing our guest organizer, Nicole. So before I do that, I also get to introduce and sort of formally open the shops for the semester. It's kind of a tradition where I get to tag along on awesome events at the beginning of the year. So lucky me, and welcome back, or welcome everybody. So if you're a student here, you probably already know generally what the Making Studio is. It's a collection of fabrication-oriented shop spaces and academic program that overlaps with those spaces. I take the opportunity to introduce it to our guests as well, but we've just spent the entire previous evening in the makerspace with a number of GSAPP students and alums talking about their practices, talking about our student work, eating, drinking beer amongst 3D printers, recovering from jet lag, new semester lag for me. So I think most of my introductions are sort of out of the way. For anybody else who isn't familiar with the sort of fabrication side, that part of the institution of GSAPP, I hope you can piece it together from just this little welcome that I give. So it's popular to describe organizations in terms of a community of people that make them up, rather than the written mission, the physical footprint, or the publicity they receive. And I think that the Making Studio, as it is really no different. And so after 3 years, 3 and change years here as the director of the space, I just recently took mental stock of what that community of people who's overlapped with the shops is, and it's enormous. So there's the 45-something students that work there on any given semester, which includes, if you include alums of the shop, it's a number that it's in its hundreds already, even just in my time here. There's the still current GSAPP students who were previous crew, who now populate studios and TA jobs or act as regular civilians at the school. There's that group of precious shop-connected studio mates of yours that you can bribe or guilt into getting inside info or access to the shops. We all know who they are. There's the people who spend more time in the shops than some of our actual shop monitors and contribute in myriad ways, even without getting paid. I'd pay them if I could. There's the singularly talented students at GSAPP who stick to studio and don't actually use the shops much at all, but they might come through once or twice in their time here, pull something amazing out, and sort of change the knowledge base of the shop just based on their tiny little footprint there. There's our new iPhone-esque line, although that might be an outdated reference at this point, but we have a line of a sneaker drop in the hall every semester for signing up for laser cutters, because it's this sort of one date that for me, at least, has become this sort of like oddly sinister but fun social event in the hallways of the shop. There's the faculty at the school that start with maybe a simple project or a collaboration in the shops that grows into something bigger and broader in their own research and project. And then there's the organizations that we partner with, like biennials and museums, nonprofits and fabricators, that have served a lot of sort of manifold purposes for the shop as publicizers of our work and your work, as experts in lending knowledge to us, and in some cases conduits for student employment after school. It's like the thing where people go off and become lobbyists. We have some people that are working as, in the fabrication industry that have been through the shop. And then finally, there's people like our guest speakers today, whose work really props up the value not only of just made things, physical things, and industrious work, but whose message is really essential to sustaining our shop. And I think that's why I get to sort of tag along with this every year. And that's why I'm really thankful to be given a little part of this conversation, because our shops would not be the same without talking to people like these. So finally, there's just a couple of terms or words that have emerged repeatedly, either in conversation last night with the group of people, or sort of in my thoughts in preparation for the new year, or this event, that I think sort of bring our work together with the sort of work, the sort of state of making, as it were, here. So one of them is resourcefulness. One of the most illuminating things I've encountered in studying the practices that we'll see today is how much they're informed by context and availability of people and materials, supply chains and stuff like that. But how congruent they are to like the really highest aspirations of people sort of working in this sort of computer-inspired world here at GSAPP as well. And on the flip side, how making things here at Columbia is always an act of industriousness and hustle, despite the fact that we're in this city that ostensibly where everything is available and you can find anything. People find that that's not exactly the case. And it kind of goes along with the rude awakening of getting into a prestigious institution like this, where you, like the second you get your foot in the door, you're already competing for something else. for studio slots, for laser time, for jobs, for this, for that, for materials, for cramming things on the subway or the Uber XLs to get them back. Everybody sort of carves out their own hustle of making things here, and I think that really contributes to the sort of making culture of the school and the work that we see today as well. It almost makes me glad that we don't have a store where we sell things in the shop. I mean, I'm glad about that for other reasons, but it really requires everybody to find not only new sources for things, but new things themselves and bring them into the shop where we have to deal with it at that point. It's kind of that act of going out of your familiar space, both in metaphysical and literal terms. It's key to being a successful maker here, and I think we'll see that today as well. So the second word is collaboration. So when I was in school, I'll just say less than 10 years ago, or you can guess, I arrived at school with this notion, this rumor, this like cutthroat, individualistic, like ruthlessly capitalistic place where students hide screens from each other and sabotage each other's models where they're not looking. I'm sure you've like all heard the same rumors that I think are sort of urban legend at this point. So I went in there ready to like say, no, I'm going to fight this culture. But when I got there, everybody was already way ahead of me. The sort of notion of sharing as a way of production was already full in swing. And then I was actually the one that was a little like on edge when I was coming in. And so everybody else had to sort of settle me down. And then since then, that conversation's continued in architecture education as mandates to cross-list courses, visual studies, and building technology, or cross-disciplinize the work we do at GSAPP, to render intrinsic expertises in the field, in the city, and so the greater context of New York City, and also to professional practice, where we've been asking more seriously what constitutes sort of a contribution to a work, and how credit should be considered or reconsidered, and where a misunderstanding of this over the last century may amount to injustice that actually has to be rectified. So parallel to those conversations, which we all know over the last 10 years, making always seems to be this necessarily collaborative act. You always need others to help teach, to explain, to listen, to just hold things up for you while you plan something together, to not return your emails about powder coating something. We've all been there. So made things are really out there in the physical world in a way that digital models are not, and they just serve as connectors of people and ideas. We see this in the speaker's individual work as well as in conversation, that their work is singularly creative, as you'll see, but the story they tell often reveals a whole network of interconnected people. And then the last word that I want to talk about is the word risk, and that's the literal risk of using fast, sharp, spinning metal on your soft, fleshy, cuttable hands in the shops, but also the risk of making a wrong movement into a piece of material that you've been working for 4 days straight and not ruining it. And just the general risk of the uncertainty of outcomes that comes with working with materials and methods that are less deterministic than, say, Illustrator. But that's kind of an unfair characterization of Illustrator. So the educator David Pye called this practice the workmanship of risk. And I think the term is a little outdated and gendered, but the substance of the idea is very true to the way that our students and the guests are working physically. And they're doing much more to bridge the gaps between physical and digital than they are to draw boundaries between them. So it's really this assumption and embrace of risk and uncertainty of outcomes that is something that I think unites their work. And it also goes a long way to describe the state of making at GSAPP, which I'm asked to do sort of like every year. Okay, so I'm going to turn the floor over to our guests. I'm going to introduce Mpo Matsipa, who's a continuing institution at GSAPP. She's known around here for her stewardship of the Studio X Global Workshop in Johannesburg up to about 2 years ago. She currently lives in Johannesburg as a researcher at the Whit City Institute. She has an architecture degree from Cape Town, PhD from Berkeley. She writes, critiques, collaborates, curates, produces exhibitions all over the world. And today we have her here in Avery. So, thank you and welcome.
Thank you very much, Josh, for such generous introduction. And I also want to say a very heartfelt thank you to Lila, who made this event possible. It's been a very productive set of conversations with Josh over the past couple of months, just sort of thinking about what kind of conversation we might want to have. And I have to say that, and Lila mentioned this yesterday when we were meeting with students in the making studio, that Lila and I first met when we were working on a conference at Columbia called The Desires, the African City, which was a collaboration between Global Africa Lab, myself, and Dina Malandros, where we were really exploring the idea of Africa as a site of imagination and trying to deviate from well-worn tropes of crisis and lack that attach themselves to discussions about African cities. And so Africa as method, Africa as framework, Africa as analytical and creative framework. So today's panel and set of conversations is really part of a larger set of engagements at GSAPP that has been concerned with how African urban imaginaries might be informed by contemporary urban transformations in African cities and also cities in the diaspora. We've been interested in how artists racialize blackness and their own creativity in ways that don't repeat the two dominant tropes that attach themselves to African urban environments. Firstly, tropes that portray African societies as simple, ahistorical, attractive, connected time. And secondly, the idea of the slum as a vector of social death, a time space that tracks the territorialization of Black lives solely as a locus of Black death and anti-Black violence. Instead, collectively, we've been interested in how Blackness functions as a site of radical imagination and new modes of representation. So today's panel discussion is another layer in this kind of radical reimagination of African and Black space by engaging with people who are actively engaged with the work of making. And it is a profound privilege for me to have these four incredibly talented individuals come to join this conversation and to share their work with us. Not least because as a South African, it becomes increasingly important to stress the importance of Pan-African conversations and to think creatively about the ways that we can work across territorial boundaries that are not necessarily of our own making. So in order to not disrupt the flow of conversation, I'm going to introduce all four of our presenters today so that we can have a fairly smooth set of conversations. So the first person that I'm going to introduce is Nifemi Marcus Bello, who is the founder of nmbello Studio, an industrial design practice located in the heart of Lagos, Nigeria, with a focus on product, furniture, and experience design for both local and international clients. The practice creates sustainable and economically viable products and solutions by identifying underutilized or neglected production techniques and technology. With human and material sustainability in mind, the studio prides itself in considering human and material production and economical integrity in its design process, while taking into great consideration the ecosystem stakeholders and users of the final product. I should also mention that Nifemi Bello is an incredibly wonderful human being and a new father, so we're very lucky to have him here when there are very major life-changing events happening in his life elsewhere. Secondly, our second panelist will be Nifemi, who is the co-founder of Studio Propolis with his partner Bethan Reina. Studio Propolis is a Nairobi-based design workshop founded in 2005. Vijay and Reina each hold a Masters of Architecture from the University of Edinburgh. Their work combines a formal education as architects with informal training as furniture makers. They're passionate about making things and work with different materials across disciplines and scales. The relationship between locally available materials and their own craft culture informs how they make and design. It is through their direct involvement in the process of making, in the workshop, that forms the core of the studio's practice. The ability to continually test ideas through prototyping and production underpins this methodology, and it has given Propolis the space to innovate and experiment, building an intimate knowledge of how things are made and how to build locally. Their commissions have been diverse, and projects range from the design and construction of buildings to prototyping furniture and manufacturing small runs that make up an ongoing collection of pieces, including furniture for the April 2019 IKEA Author Out collection. Thirdly, Thabisa Mjo is the founder and Johannesburg-based of the Johannesburg-based Mashti Design Studio, a studio focused on telling uniquely South African stories using the medium art design. And Thabisa is quite insistent that design becomes a medium for storytelling rather than simply being something that produces artifacts. She's also the curator of Sacrosanct, the first collective showing of South African design at Inbound Design Week 2019. And she was awarded Designer of the Most Beautiful Object in South Africa for her 222.0 Pendant Light in 2018 by Design Endowment. In 2017, she received the Future Found Award from Design Foundation and 100% Design South Africa for the Best Product Design and Best Emerging Talent in 2016. So we're very lucky to have you here. And finally, I have the pleasure of introducing DK Osei-Wasare, who is co-founder and principal of architecture and integrated design studio Low Design Office, LODO, which is based in Austin, Texas, and also in Tama, Ghana. He currently holds a triple appointment at Penn State as an assistant professor of architecture and engineering design. He's also the director of the Humanitarian Materials Lab and associate director of Penn State's Alliance for Education, Science, Engineering, and Design with Africa. Osei-Wasare is a Tech graduate, is a Tech Global Fellow, a Fulbright Scholar, and Africa for Tech Digital Champion. He's also the co-founder of the design agency from 2009 to 2011, and the Agbogbloshi Makerspace platform and open source making tech initiative here for Africa. So please join me in welcoming these four incredible individuals from West Africa.
My name is Nifemi Marcus Bello. I'm an industrial designer based in Lagos, Nigeria. I run an autonomous design studio called nmbello Studio. We design furniture, products, and experiences. So, like I mentioned, we're based in Lagos, commercial capital of Nigeria and Africa. And controversial. But we're also known for three things: music, fashion, and traffic. So I'm going to walk you through some of the manufacturing hubs in Lagos. As a studio, what we tend to do is we actually have a very little maker space in our studio. But what we do is we design around manufacturing processes and local availability, trying to create economically viable products and solutions, and collaborating with artisans such as welders, weavers, and then we also tend to find modern day manufacturing that's available around the city as well. So this first image shows a place located just about an hour away from the studio called King Village. So it's a manufacturing hub located under a bridge in Lagos State. At the age of 13, I was lucky and unlucky enough to be sent here to actually have an apprenticeship for the summer. Yeah, first day, I think I cried about 10 minutes. But it was worth it because it actually dictated a lot of what I'm sort of doing right now, what I'm curious about in Lagos. So King Village is a very fascinating place because it's a mixture of welders, weavers from Ghana who migrated from Ghana to Lagos to find work, and also weavers from the eastern parts of Nigeria and also the western parts of Nigeria. Another place is Bariga, and again at the age of 14 I had an internship here, apprenticeship here. I tend to visit quite a lot as well because Bariga is very interesting because a lot of manufacturers in Lagos get their wood from Bariga. But unfortunately for us, the wood actually comes from the western part of, the eastern and western part of Nigeria, and it's locked through water. It's brought in through water. It comes in as wet wood, and it's really, really tough to get dry wood in Lagos. So even in the studio, we tend to avoid wood because I know I was speaking to Naeem as well, saying, "No, how's the wood in Nairobi?" And he's like, "Terrible." And I thought it was just us. So it's brought in through water, and it takes ages to dry. But it's still a fascinating place because local carpenters tend to spend a lot of time here fabricating, sourcing wood as well. That's me in my shorts, it's a regular Saturday. just looking around and speaking to people and looking for availability as well. And just to let you know that we've actually designed products around all these hubs, and I'll share them with you as well. So the last manufacturing hub is Ikeja. I actually grew up here. It's a very, very fascinating place. It's a mixture of modern day technology, and one of the biggest mobile phone markets is actually based in Ikeja, called Computer Village. Here you can actually find local manufacturing and also modern day technology manufacturing. So I'll speak further on that as well once I start speaking on the products. Traffic. Lagos is known for its traffic, as you can imagine, human traffic as well. It's fascinating to watch. A lot of creativity happens during traffic.
Yes.
It happens during traffic, and I'm going to share with you one of the products that we actually highlighted in the studio called Quali, and how this traffic has sort of brought to light creativity in Lagos. So, just a break here, just to say that when I was going to give this talk, I had a few friends who are architects, because I'm not an architect, I'm an industrial designer. I sat with them and I said, I'm giving a talk at the School of Architecture at Columbia. And they asked me, so what's it going to be called? And I said, oh, it's Lagos, a designer's utopia. And they're like, what? Like, nothing works here. We don't have 24-hour electricity. The roads are terrible. Production doesn't happen here. Like, everyone's going to China. So I said, no, actually, I think the beauty of all of this happening is the fact that even the guys complaining to me is the fact that they've sort of embraced the constraints to try and create as much as possible, and always at the same time really thinking about the ecosystem and how it works, and how just one little product can affect the city and hopefully impact and improve manufacturing capabilities as well. So, innovation in traffic. This was done about 2 weeks ago at the studio. We've had this curiosity and fascination with how people tend to make solutions out of nothing in Lagos. And one of the products that we've highlighted is called the Quali. Quali is 100% recyclable. It's recycled as well. It's made out of styrofoam, cardboard, and sellotape. And it actually just costs 20 cents to make. And the guys, as you can see, the guy down there actually sells it for $1, sometimes $1.38. It's a fascinating product, and it actually shows the resourcefulness that happens in Lagos and how we have been inspired by the city to take the same approach. It's lightweight, so that's Mohammed on the far left there. He works, I think he says he works a 12-hour shift a day to provide for his wife. And it's extremely important to him to have this this product to help enhance his business, because he can actually stand it against the car, or it has a stand just attached to the back of the product as well. And during traffic, he can just pick it up when there's like really slow traffic, and he can walk around and people can wind down their glasses and say, hey, I want biscuits, I want gum. Or another example of the Quali is sunglasses shop, where the hawker is just basically walking around the streets, and he basically says he sells out sunglasses every week, which is incredible. So, utopia, dystopia. For me, I think designing in Lagos and designing around the hub is an extreme utopia. What we are hopefully trying to do in the studio is not just be the ones to dictate the type of design that we create, but actually collaborate with these hubs and with the manufacturers and local guys that I've highlighted as well. So, there's always this huge debate around the studio as well on what good and bad design is in Lagos, contextually, and figuring out why we have to make what we design in Lagos. And if we're trying to do good design, does it really have to sort of hit a few points here and there? Functionality, empathy, social connectivity. Does it really matter? And this framework we created basically to help dictate and guide the type of design that we do, the type of work that we put out, and also making sure that we're considering not just the user of a product, but the manufacturer, even the distributors, and also suppliers of raw materials. For functionality, of course, the ease of use of the product is extremely important. For empathy, of course, ethnographic research, you're really thinking about the cultural context of who you're really designing for as well. For social connectivity, I think one thing about designing for Lagosians and trying to reach the rest of the world is that they want to understand why you're designing the product, even though it's useful. They want a story behind it, and we've realized that sometimes we really have to tap into what they want to feel emotionally once we start designing the product. So the first product I'll speak on is the LM School that we designed, I think, in 2015. It was designed, it's an amazing product that really allowed us to start thinking about how to create in the studio and how to make. And one thing that happened was that we were designing a product for a client, hoping to make it in Nigeria, and he told us, look, this product can't be made in Lagos, it's impossible. It's extremely black. The production cost will kill us, we'll have to do all this tooling, etc. So we lost that brief. And I got so curious about why can't we just design products that are affordable, that people can actually touch and feel and understand that, okay, we've designed this around, we've basically designed something that's made locally and can also be distributed locally and internationally. So in my research, in one of the hubs that I mentioned, in Kedra, I stumbled onto a generator manufacturer that was manufacturing generator casings. They've been running for about 5 years, but they've just been making generator casings and products with products that had to do with electricity and a bit of generators as well. So after I spoke to them, I told them, I said, wow, you guys have an amazing assembly line, and it would be amazing if you would give us a few hours just to walk through and see what production capabilities you had. And after walking through, I realized that they had amazing equipment, but weren't producing as much as they could have, and just designing and producing this one product. So one afternoon, I went into the, just like Naeem said yesterday, I went into their factory and with cardboard, and I said, hey, I think I have an idea for a product. I've gone through your production line, and if you give me a couple of weeks, we'll come up with a final product that's economically viable, that's different from what you're actually producing right now, and then we'll also diversify your manufacturing portfolio. So the first week, what happened was I went in there, didn't really know what we were going to do, either furniture or electrical components, etc. Had a conversation with them and realized that there was a niche actually for furniture. And after sitting with them, I said, okay, we're going to design a multifunctional piece that people will actually resonate with, because people know, people are familiar with metal in Nigeria for generators. And we already have that emotional connectivity. But how can we design a product that people want to use, want to touch, or even want to collect? So after that conversation, I sat down, I started sketching. They then started talking to me about the constraints, the availability with the laser cutters and bending, etc. And I realized that, of course, communicating with them visually, we had to do it 3D as well. So I went in there with my cardboard and a Stanley knife and started cutting and sketching again and again. And we finally came up with a form, which is the LM stool. It was quite tough because, of course, they had never done anything like this before, and they were still a bit hesitant, saying, I don't know how people are going to react to this, or if it's something that we can put forward. And I think for the first 2 months, it didn't really do too well from the student's perspective. But afterwards, we started getting international orders, so we started creating economical viability for the company. And through that, we've also developed other products apart from this stool. Now we've just designed a bin that we're going to pitch to Lagos State to see if they can put it in every single bus stop in Lagos State as well. And then we're also developing a lamp as well with them. So that's the stool. It can be sat on, and objects can be placed on it as well. So, yeah. As you can tell already, I'm an introvert. But this was sort of an interesting product because it's a bit selfish. But at the same time, one of the reasons why the design came up was I got approached by an architect to design furniture for a space. And I walked through the space, it was a co-working space, and I walked through the space and realized that it wasn't functional for introverts at all. And I was just thinking in my head, how am I going to work here? Like, this just doesn't seem right. And after the long conversation, he then sat me down and said, okay, you know what? If you just design one piece for us that actually will bring in introverts, then we'll commission you. So that was the introverts chair, and it got shown in the Venice Architectural Biennale in 2016, because one of the curators found it fascinating. So this is actually made under the bridge in Lagos. It's designed around what's the weavers, the skill set of the weavers and the welders as well. And I'm happy to say that the guy who actually taught me how to weld at 13 was the one that welded this as well, which is pretty cool. So after a bunch of conversations with the client, we're actually doing research on what, of course, the issues with introverts working in co-working spaces. We started ideating around creating some sort of cocoon, a comfortable cocoon for people to work out of. That would be like a singular structure that was also very portable, that would also manipulate the space in the room as well. But then also from a maker's point of view, I think one of the main issues with craftsmen in Nigeria is that there's very high level of illiteracy amongst them, and designing around what they can do is basically trying to figure out how you can create a physical object for them to understand your sort of design or final design adaptation that you're trying to do. So when I do sketch in the studio once in a while, but I actually sit with the craftspeople with my pen and paper, sketching in front of them and having conversations. As you can see here, this is a 3D print that I did in Lagos as well, actually 3D printing real scale, and then showing it to them, and then we're discussing what type of welding should be done, and they're also giving me advice on what sorts of materials should be used, etc. Even with the chair, speaking with the so even with the chair, working with the weavers, they basically were teaching me about weaving techniques, educating me on some of the constraints that we're having, and also speaking on how to allow light to pass through the chair as well. Because I also mentioned to them about claustrophobia, because I'm also claustrophobic. This is, I think, the last project that we did before I left for New York. It's an installation designed for a designer based in Lagos, but now has moved to London. He's called Kenneth Ize. He was an LVMH movie this year. So he had a show in Paris, and he came up to me and said, "Hi, if I need you to design an installation for me." And I said, "Okay, cool." And we sat down and realized there was a huge problem, and he told me what the problem was, and we tried to tackle it not just with the installation, but with the product that actually made the installation. So he told me, "So Nif, the main issue," and the reason why I actually approached you was because of a loom. The loom that they actually weave my cloth with. And so we sat down and had a conversation in the studio about the loom, and he told me what the limitations were. So one of the main issues with the loom for the weavers was that it wasn't portable. It also had a great impact on their body, because even the sitting while using the loom was quite affecting their lower back. They couldn't dismantle it and just put it into public transportation. They always had to order a taxi, which also increased the cost for transportation as well. So after he told me all of that, we then decided to try to bring in some of these weavers into the studio, asked them to please weave a few of his pieces, had a conversation with them, started recording. We had a few video recordings. Unfortunately, I can't put them up just yet. But we had a few video recordings on them actually weaving, watching what their techniques were, looking at their sitting positions and their posture, and then afterwards asking them what the main issues are. After all of that, we started designing around what the problems were, having conversations with the weavers and Kenneth as well. Whilst doing all of that, not just sketching as well, but not just me sketching, but actually trying to force the weavers to sketch as well, which is quite annoying. Picking it up from there. So the idea was basically to figure out how to improve the loom, and we basically reduced we improved the portability of the loom by making it collapsible, also creating a two-level chair seating for the weavers as well, and it also has storage where they can actually store their thread before weaving as well. I have a few minutes left, so I'll just rush through really quick. This is a product that we designed as well called Table. It's also made locally in Lagos, made out of reclaimed wood. The top is actually plywood. It's very sturdy because that's what we use in the studio. And it was basically to design around the production that was happening in Bariga, and figuring out how to use, because a lot of the carpenters actually embrace reclaimed wood because it's dry in comparison to local wood. So designing around that and making sure that to consider the end user in the sense that how could we design a table for a modern day African who's basically moving from one place to another, either for work or for home. That's table. So, yeah.
Thanks. My name is Naeem. Okay. Well, the title is meant to be Crafting Exchange. Okay. It's how we use our workshop. So, can I get it to play? This is a snapshot of our route to work in Nairobi. It's totally chaotic. It's a complete, utter mess. We really struggle with basic infrastructure around roads, around water, around electricity. And similarly, in our everyday working environment, we have very little access to specialists, absence of building manuals, building codes, and and even hardware stores. Yet out of this apparent lack, people find an amazing resourcefulness, and they become really ingenious in finding different ways to get things made, using the limited resources available that allows them to improvise around everyday building challenges in a very ingenious way. So this is on one of our sites at the moment where these are reinforcement bars being bent. And I think it's so beautiful watching the way this guy's bending his perfect circle. I mean, it's incredible. I set up my practice with my wife Beth about 15 years ago, and these are the challenges we face every day. You know, our challenge is, how do we negotiate this gap as architects, this gap of how, you know, between how we design something and how we get it built differently, in a way that uses whatever levels of craftsmanship and materials that we have available. And in doing so, do it in a way that, you know, we can make a high quality product. We had our training in Scotland, but what we are struggling to do and trying to find is what, and the question we're asking is, what are our terms of engagement as architects in Africa, or as Kenyan architects? What are those terms of engagement? In a situation as ours, we have found that a more traditional kind of linear path of procurement and more distanced production doesn't work well. You know, we have to, as designers, we have to get really involved. To be designers and work as designers alone is just not enough. We have to get involved at every stage, and you know, we have to wear many hats and try and explore all aspects of how to make things. These are some of the, on all our building sites, I think it's amazing how people make tools on building sites. Just bending stuff, making stuff, and find this everywhere, from recycled bottle tin from old bottle tops, or, you know, I love the hacksaw. Anyway, we call it Juakali, this kind of culture exists all over the so-called developing world, and it's called, I don't know what you guys call it in South Africa, but you've got a term for it as well. This ingenious kind of making of something with nothing. This is our workshop. Our workshop has become an essential part of our studio. But, you know, neither me or my wife, well, we've had an informal training, we've worked in many workshops in different ways, but, you know, to suddenly set up your own workshop and run it, make a living doing it, is a completely different story. So we had to start with ourselves. You know, to complement our formal training, we had to reskill ourselves and actually craft what we design. And, you know, today we use our workshop to do all sorts of things. Puppets for Broadway. We brought a musical to Broadway last year. Architecture and joinery work. This is our kind of store where we kind of collect all sorts of bits of wood. Designing and prototyping for IKEA. There was a collection that's just launched, but, you know, using our workshop to make stuff, make models, working at different scales. Yeah. It's a little scribble I made for my mother, because she's always kind of confused as to why her son, who's an architect, shows up to pick up the children covered in sawdust, looking filthy as hell. Now, the exciting thing about learning new skills is whether it's improving what we design or how we make something, or how we collaborate with others, is that we think through those skills. The output of one project tends to generate a useful input when applied to the next. This is a positive feedback loop, and we call it, or might thought of, as crafting exchange, where the cycle of what we learn in one project has and how we apply it on the next has a direct way of improving how we run our practice. And this is something I've seen that very much happens at GSAPP in the Maker Lab. It's about that. It's almost like a contemporary form of a guild system where people are feeding off each other, and that's made me so happy to see that that exists here, because, you know, so much emphasis is given on technology and having the latest robot, or but this is about people informing each other and real, actual physical making that feeds off each other, and there's no substitute for that. The idea of exchange is central to how we think and make things, whether we're designing for ourselves to make, or whether we're designing for someone else to make, or whether we're designing to make something with someone else. all of these processes set up a very different condition of working. I mean, the greatest challenge for us when we stop being students and, you set up your own business is, we left as students really enjoying drawing and making, not running a business. And so what we struggle with every day is there a pointer here? Can I point? The green button, side button, is, well, it's there's, oh thanks. There's a scale here, so now we try and keep it kind of in this zone here where, if, for us, like, designing is a very physical process. And if we slide too far down the scale this way, we sit at a computer all day, or you go the other way and you just become a factory worker, just churning stuff out day after day. And it's really like keeping it in this zone where we're using the studio as a design space is what's super important for us. So here's an example. Like, this is a most recent project. We talked about it yesterday. It's designing a jug for IKEA, and this was completely freestyle. They have a co-working space. Everyone's sitting on their computers, went into a meeting, ready to speak on a, write notes, and everyone's on the computer. We put that all aside, and we said, okay, right, we're all here. Let's actually design this thing now in the room. We've come all the way from Nairobi to Sweden. We're not going to go backwards and forwards. Let's just design it now. And it's about what Jason was saying about risk. It's totally free, so we didn't know what we were doing when we started. We started modelling it. You start modelling two spouts. Yeah, quite like it. Experimenting, one's bigger than the other. Okay, let's try and make the handle. And suddenly you start making this handle during the meeting, and then, actually, you know what? The handle's a bit like a spout, and actually we can make a jug stack, and that's quite a nice function of it. And then, we had limited time, and the way we added colour was then about, using colour to denote function. In contrast, this was a year ago, again, with a similar kind of team all round. We waited this is really dumb design, where we waited we'd all got there exhausted all the way from Nairobi, waited this queue. IKEA's got the same queue for the 3D printer, and 24 hours later, this bloody stuff comes out, and it's all it comes out, and you can see you need the next iteration already, and so the Senate would call it an over-determination of error. It's so well drawn, and so it's just printed, and it's uncritiquable. You can't do anything with it. This then, we could move on with it. It went straight to the manufacturer, and on we go. Here, to scale up, this is a current project that we're working on. And so here the situation is how to then use our workshop at a different scale to communicate in a way that's not just drawings and models alone, which architects do, but we can push things further in a way that gives us a greater agency and okay, here I'll just play. Play. And then I'll describe what's going on here. So, what the situation is it's a building which is about that high off the ground because it's on a swamp, and we've got this concrete detailed edge where we were worried that the contractor would not be able to cast the perfect edge. So instead of giving him a drawing, which we can do, give him the formwork so he can actually, perfectly cast the edge of the building. And in doing so, we negotiate a condition with the contractor and bring a different form of value to our engagement with the contractor, the engineer, and it allows us to engage differently. So it worked as a tool for mass production, employing local fabrication techniques, and results in a form of exchange that opens up a different way of working. It's a project we worked on recently, which is a new build cathedral, where We made a lot of the furniture and all the pieces inside, all the ceremonial pieces. And it's been a super important project for us because it's really, for us, brought to the fore the challenges of trying to make really high-end products in a context informed with limitations. So here are some of the pieces we made. So these were kind of brass and rusty metal, candle stands for all the ceremonial stuff. I've never carved marble before. The client says, can you carve marble? Of course I can carve marble. I do it all the time. Just take it out, you know. Holy water fonts, raw steel and marble. And that was really fun, you know, finding the marble, splitting it, book matching it, and then, you know, fitting all the glass in the building, all the specialist glass. All the glass was imported from this one manufacturer in America that manufactures this glass, and and so this glass artist was using it, but you know, the architect had forgotten that there was artwork going in the building, you know, and suddenly we have to kind of resolve how it's all mounted. And then the furniture. So, I mean, these are some of the pieces, and so I want to talk about the furniture to start with, because these were really important. And so, starting firstly with ourselves, how we designed for ourselves to make. So the cathedral, it's the most important piece of furniture in a cathedral. That's where the word cathedral comes from. The curved shape was informed by the building, and it became the building became the starting point for a language that carried through all the other pieces. But the challenge was how to bend this back in an elegant way. You know, this monitor's not working. This one? Okay. Should I just use this? Again, this is this idea of risk, which I totally embrace. You know, don't expect that laser cutter to do it. You know, in that process of actually that laborious process, boring, layering all this card to try and get this curved shape and scraping it away, it's, you know, it started to inform how this, you know, thing was going to emerge. And don't be scared of it being messy, because it doesn't matter, you know, it's an experiment. And what this process tells us is that, you know, when you embrace risk, the outcome is a confidence that you can trust in the process of design. And I think that is one of the greatest challenges we have as designers, is that we lose confidence in our own gut instinct and skill as designers. So that basically this evolution of, this is part of the cathedral, and we experimented with different shapes and forms to get joints and different scales. And you know, it's always when you're trying to resolve a chair, you have to work it one-to-one, joints don't go far enough, and making prototypes is really the only way to do it, because you don't want to start correcting mistakes in mass production. And then, you know, this is kind of prototyping. We made so many, this is just a couple here, with so many prototypes in terms of how we could clamp the back, because that was totally slowing down how we would make it. So here is a little video of us resolving the back. Can we get some sound? No? It's okay. Yeah, you see Beth doing all the work. I promise I do stuff as well. Well, I'll speak over it then. This is cypress wood. It was grown at the site. It's a huge problem getting any form of sustainable timber in a lot of our African contexts. But this takes a timber that's usually used for the construction industry, and you know, trying to make a really beautiful high-end product out of it, for us, sets a benchmark for what could be achieved with the rest of the project. And so what we had to do here, actually, And again, this solutions to a situation where things are not available is you can't buy veneer, so we had to make our own veneer. We cut all this 1mm veneer on a saw, and I don't recommend doing that. My wife actually went from making 40 chairs to having a baby the next day. So she was working right at the end, actually. She didn't stop, didn't even have a day off. She's super strong. I wish there was the music name. Next time.
Oh, you could just sing.
So the other kind of interesting thing that emerged through this process was, you know, the building has got these very beautiful parabolic kind of curved arches, and the contractor actually used a similar technique to make his formwork for building the building. So there's this, I think, beautiful transposition of a building that's a piece of furniture that's tied to this, to the architecture of the building, and you know, rather than just kind of aesthetically, there's a formal kind of relationship between how the two are constructed and relate. This was not that many, it was 40. 2 minutes left. Thank you. Okay, on we go. Chairs. So, and then we have the pews. The pews were informed, but you know, to fit 1,000 people in a building, an unusual plan. You know, there's a prototyping process that goes on that was very much about the relationship between the sitter and the kneeler. And how to bring these two close together to allow to get more people into the building. You know, what we had to do, it's on the images, but anyway, that thing was then, critical thing was to design custom-made ironmongery that allowed this position to be brought closer together. The critical thing in this pews was to come up with a design that was forgiving for someone else to make, you know, come out of logical sections with shadow gaps, offsets that allow something to go together in an accommodating way. We had to be involved in every part of the process. We had to get the ironmongery made. We had to, you know, draw stacking. I had explained to the guy to make, the guy who made it had to stack everything, and then we made a final version of the pews with the production kind of, I suppose, catalogue was that we produced with all the jigs, the templates, cutting lists, and ironmongery, and we made a prototype using that to make sure it all goes together properly. This is the production of the pews, and these are the pews in the final building. So then, the hardest part of this whole commission, which is the most technically challenging, was making the front doors of the building. You know, we have to be really involved in the whole process in this. And these doors serve as giant display cases for these bronze panels, which the client had commissioned. There was an artist who had made them. It was about integrating these imperfect kind of pieces into a much more precisely manufactured object. There were lots of physical constraints too. These doors weigh 700 kilos each, and I was making them with a friend, and because my wife was at home at this point, and you know, without any mechanical lifting equipment, these doors have to come apart, go together very cleverly on site to allow it. Each door had about 500 drilled and tapped bolts. And they had to be kind of flawlessly made inside and outside for it to go together perfectly. You need an excellent set of drawings to do that. There was so many drawings. But, you know, to actually make the drawings, you need to know what you're making it with. How does welding look in 2.8mm steel versus 3.5? What's the weight difference when you do that, you know? How does the tape up, the laser cutter, affect how it welds together? All these things are so important. Can you actually then, like, what we wanted to do is, can you make it without actually putting a grinder to the piece? Because we didn't want grinder marks on this kind of raw steel. Once we'd overcome our own kind of technical challenges in prototyping it, you know, there were other people involved, from sourcing material to getting bronze sourced to getting all this stuff sourced, and that was all kind of done locally around our workshop. This is how the doors start to clamp together, and we use our woodworking skills to kind of square off and put things together, making the ironmongery in bronze, the door locks. Starts to go together. So this was the big challenge, was the hinge. You buy a hinge. As an architect, you specify a hinge, a pivot hinge, but this hinge has to go into an imperfect opening. It has to be adjustable. These ones weren't. We had to hack the hinge. In Africa, we call it tropicalization. It's what we do to Japanese vehicles when they come. We have to kind of change the radiator. You strip it of its electrics, you jack it up, you soup it up to make it suitable to work on the roads. And that's what we had to do to the hinge. We had to hack it in a similar way. So, you know, the contractor's just giving you an open hole on site. Oh, come fit your hinges, it's all ready, everything's ready. So you have to make jigs and templates that allow this hinge to also fit very precisely. Because we've driven 5 hours to go to site to do this. So we made all these jigs to mount it all, to allow it all to fit, and then weld it into site. And then this is us hacking the hinge to then allow it to be adjustable. So that's refabricating it, yeah. I mean, and then we have to go through the same level of care, I'm nearly done, to integrate the artwork. And, you know, so you have this process, the artist is doing all the clays, and it's the lost wax technique, and so many processes go into it, from making the clay panels to caster to then casting the bronze. It had to be done in pieces. And it eventually goes together. But the important thing in all this is the idea of tolerance. As architects, we talk about tolerance, which is about the fit, how things fit into other things. You don't want it to be too baggy, too tight. But, you know, I mean, like Nifemi saying, when you have, you know, like the artist and the bronze guy, they had no idea what we were talking about tolerance. Their work had never had to fit into someone else's work. It's not a convention that they are used to working within. So we have to then use our workshop and rather than to change how they work, we have to accommodate this imperfection in the way they work, so we make jigs and templates that allow their work to fit into ours. And it's these micro-interventions that are, you know, are preemptive measures that we can take as architect makers that safeguard the sanctity of the overall dimension and ensure that everything comes together. And critically then, for us, tolerance is how we as designers absorb other people's design thinking into our own way of thinking. Rather than making you change, you don't have a measuring tape. Why should I be beating you with some precision AutoCAD drawing? It means nothing to you. Take what you're making, absorb it into the way I'm working, and find a convention that allows your work to fit into mine. And that's the big challenge. Now these are the doors coming together, and the doors finished. Yeah.
You said 500 pieces in each door?
Bolts, yeah, drilled and tapped, and that was just one aspect of it. But yeah. But they're really deadly flat, no grinder marks, and yeah, and so those were the doors. So in conclusion, 1 minute, sorry. You know, there's nothing new in what we do as designer makers, and there's also no reason why in this world of digitization and specialization that this way of working needs to be lost. In Kenya, there's this economy that allows imperfect and the perfect and the machined and the handcrafted to exist together, which is a beautiful thing that still exists. And you know, in broadening our agenda and consciously overlapping our work with work of other people, other suppliers and other craftspeople, we can bring a different form of value to the system as a whole. Collaboration is never easy, but when it does work, the lessons and rewards are unexpected and instructive. Time and again, we discover there's a real craft in collaborating that creates a mutuality. Our challenge is to aggregate this way of working and continue to use our workshop to do so, but in doing so, try and build a community around us who want to work in this way. Thanks.
My name is Nifemi Marcus Bello, and I'm the founder of Nash Tea Design Studio, which is a product design firm based in Johannesburg, South Africa. So earlier this year, I had the opportunity to exhibit at Milan Design Week with myself and a group of other South African designers. Our goal is to craft and establish South African design as a category brand. And so this installation at Milan was just one step in that direction. And so I went to film school, I graduated from film school, I majored in production design, and after working in the TV and film industry as a set designer, I decided to go back to school to study interior design because I wanted to create spaces and design objects that people in the real world could interact with. My studio's philosophy is to celebrate and to share our heritage using design. And that is how my first product came about. It is inspired by the shibelane, which is a traditional form of dress that is worn by Tsonga women who live in the northernmost part of South Africa. It's a pendant light, sorry. I named the light the Tutu 2.0 because shibelane is an African tutu. Last year, the tutu was then named the most beautiful object in South Africa, which is really cool. Another element of our heritage that I incorporate a lot in my work is weaving. So the story of Zulu basketry is really a story of revival. The baskets pictured here, those are Zulu baskets. So the Zulu baskets are made from lala palm, which is a type of grass that grows in KwaZulu-Natal, which is a province in South Africa. And they are tightly woven because people use them as containers to hold liquids. When tin and plastic containers became easily available, people obviously no longer would spend hours upon hours weaving these baskets. They would just go buy a plastic container. And so there was a serious decline in this local craft. People were no longer weaving. But in the 1960s, a drought hit South Africa, and people were facing starvation. There was a Swedish missionary who was stationed in KwaZulu-Natal, and he noticed that the local crop was dying. People are facing literal starvation, and he started thinking about ways that he could help the people create economic opportunities for themselves. And so he asked the women, why don't you guys go back to weaving these baskets? I will then export the baskets to Europe. That way you guys can generate an income. Great idea. The only challenge is that there were only 3 women left in the community who actually knew how to weave. So luckily they agreed to train everyone else. They started making all of these baskets. This minister would then export them to Europe, and that is how the economy of Zulu basketry started. Today, Zulu baskets are among the most sought after collector's items. So the woman on the far left, that's Laurentia Dlamini, she is still alive. She is one of the 3 women who was involved in reviving the Zulu basketry. The woman on the right with the glasses, that is Beauty Ngongo. Beauty Ngongo was one of the women who was taught by Laurentia to weave. Today, Beauty Ngongo is one of the most renowned, if not the most renowned, Zulu basket weaver. Her work is part of the permanent collection at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and is also in the Smithsonian. So this basket on the bottom here is in the Smithsonian. Laurentia Dlamini no longer weaves because of her eyesight. So the last thing she made was that basket at the top, and that was sold into like a private collection in 2014. So how I got to work with Beauty Ngongo. We were commissioned by a French curator to design a bench for the Revelations Fair. So the Revelations Fair happens every 2 years, and it's basically a platform for the best crafts in all of the world. So I collaborated with another furniture brand in South Africa called Houtelander, and once we had made this bench, we were now desperately trying to find weavers to weave the backrest. We called every single art center, every single foundation that represents weavers, and everyone said, no, it's not possible. The technique only works in round forms. The bench is obviously not round, I'll show you guys the bench. And just out of sheer desperation and exasperation, I just asked a friend of mine who happens to live in KwaZulu-Natal, and that is where the Zulu baskets are from, if she knew anyone who could help us. And she says to me, yeah, my grand can do it. I'm like, that's cute. The master weaver. And she goes, no, seriously, my grand can do it. Google her. I Googled her Beauty Ngongo. A book has been written about her work. And as I said, she's at the Met, at the Smithsonian, at the V&A in London. And so we took this bench down to her. And she said to us, no, only round. And we begged, and we pleaded, and we begged some more. And just to get rid of us, I said, okay, fine, I'll try. And she tried, and I mean, come on. So, yeah, it was launched at the Revelations Fair at the Grand Palais in Paris. And these are the 2 other women who helped her weave the bench, which is just incredible. So the best thing about working with Beauty, afterwards she said to us, I wish you guys had come to me earlier when I was younger, because I would have more time to expand on my technique and to build the collection, because all of this time we always thought we can only make rounds. And the lala palm, which is the grass that they used to weave, they actually hand dye it themselves, just using vegetation in the area, which is incredible. And they can as you guys mentioned here, all of those colors, that's all from plants in their backyards, literally, which is crazy. So another element of our craft, of our heritage, that I use a lot in my work is beading. So last year I had the opportunity to collaborate with Reinventing Studios, which is a beading studio that is based in Cape Town, South Africa. So they are best known for interpreting artists' work in beading and in mosaics. So together we made a drinks cabinet, and that motif that is on the front of the cabinet is actually hand beaded, which is insane. It took the ladies 6 weeks to hand bead each panel.
Wow.
Which is and the picture on the right here, that was, we made it onto the cover of El Deco Italia supplementary issue about Milan Design Week, and our installation was named the must-see installation during land design week, which is really incredible. So in closing, I wanted to share a quick story with you guys. So a friend of mine is pursuing her master's at a university in Italy. And so she was just telling her professor about this goal that we have. And our goal is to craft and establish South African design as a category brand. So she wanted to get his insights because Italy has basically done the same with their made in Italy label. And her professor says to her, oh no, that's not possible because Africans don't have heritage. Oh. I know, instant thing. And so, that's right. I know, that's awful. However, that's his opinion, and he's entitled to his opinion. She's like, no, he's not entitled to his opinion. And that's fine. However, using design, we will continue to share our craft and our heritage with the world, and most importantly, to use that heritage to create economic opportunities for all of the people, for all of our people, all of the people of the African continent. Thank you.
Hello, so my name is DK. I'm sorry. Are you guys all right? It's a lot of content. I mean, it's really incredible. I have to say, I mean, kudos to the organizers. I find it really phenomenal to come here to Columbia and be in this space and see this work and have this conversation. I feel very at home. And I think in some ways it makes maybe this harder and easier for me. I mean, I think a lot of these themes are very consistent with the earlier talks, so maybe I will gloss over them a bit more quickly. So I have a design studio called Low Design Office. Lodo, we've taken to calling ourselves transatlantic because we, for the past 10, 15 years, have been working out of Tema in Ghana and Austin, Texas. And we're very interested in lowness, which I won't fully explain, but I'll sort of touch on in some oblique ways. And I'm going to show sort of a cross-section of work that is a little bit less, well, it's not really conventional architecture per se. And I show this because this is sort of a diagram of our normal architectural process, which is sort of design and delivery process, a bit conventional. Also, in many cases, very linear, even though it's iterative, because you have to get approvals from the client, things have to be issued. Once you start, you have a working set of drawings, you have change orders, you have to track the construction process, etc. And in some ways, it forces you into very specific ways of working. And also, Elaine was talking about the challenges of running a business, also certain kind of conventions just in order to survive. At the same time, a lot of the places that we're interested in working in are really about intervention in a site, and particularly in super low spaces, places where nobody has any kind of money to pay for architects or pay for design services. And how do you think about design in a space like that, which is so other to what is taught typically in the academy? And what you find is that it's actually the opposite of linear. Everything is simultaneous. So you see the arrows, well, sort of are kind of going both ways, that you're kind of, and this also, if you look at this diagram, you're designing and you're researching and you're making at the same time. But oftentimes we're doing things really just to generate the resource to allow us to have an intervention in space. And a lot of the work I'll show today is work that is done with no budget at all, or $20 or $500, which is very different from some of the other things I'll show you. So very quickly, just to give you a sense of the office, because we work at very large scales and very small scale. So last time I was at Columbia, I think you guys have like a water studios project or something ongoing. So it was to present some of the urban work in that context. So I won't really rehash it other than to say, so this is a project called Columbia City for a new development outside of, you see Accra and Tema as sort of this cancer on the surface of the earth. And this is for a new development for about 150,000 people outside of the city, right opposite where the airport, the international airport, is being moved for. This is a project which is sort of multi-billion-dollar project and is now kind of in a legal situation where the land alone is valued at, at least $200 million in a country where many people don't really even see money on a day-to-day basis. So yeah, obviously the mechanics of what it means to design a project like that. And that's a project which was based off of Anam City, which is an open source sort of urban design project, which we did over a number of years in eastern Nigeria. Anam is a kind of community of peoples that live along the Iziji River, part of the Niger Delta. And that's a project which informed a lot of the work that we continue to do, in that it grew out of a multi-year participatory design process with the community, using sort of geo-referenced mapping of the site to map historical spaces, sacred spaces, where the spirits are, where the different sort of trees were planted by whomever's grandparents, and understand the sort of cultural dimensions of the landscape to inform the urban design. This is the Zichi River. And I sort of show this partly because what you find oftentimes when you're working in these spaces is that if you want something to exist within the project, you have to make it. And so in a space like this, where we were building a new sort of greenfield development on a kind of community-owned land, we had to build everything from scratch, including the brick factories, where we use this sort of relationship between excavating soil from the earth, using that for fish farming and aquaculture, training people in brick production, but also all forms of construction, and finding ways to link every sort of intervention that begins to see the project, to see the city, as a way of building skills and interlinking sort of essentially revenue flow from one site of activity to another activity as a way of helping to generate income for people as part of this community. And one thing which you'll see sort of later is that as we were doing this, oftentimes having to work with very limited resources, we found ourselves increasingly drawing on bamboo. Here, this is Atos, sort of at the base of the project, which is a kind of spirit forest of the bamboo gods, but where you could, if you had a good heart, harvest bamboo to use for projects. So, as a way of introduction, I'm going to give you kind of an origin story, and I guess in some ways maybe I'm going to zoom back out of the work a little bit and then try and zoom back in. So 10 years ago, we wrote this sort of manifesto called Afrocentricity, How to Use Existing Systems to Improve Livelihoods. This is something we've been reflecting on more because we're now sort of in a phase of building out a sort of, or writing a new manifesto, but this was a study of the city of Tema, which is also where I live. You can see it here. It's, and part of by way of introduction, Accra and Tema are often talked about separately, but when you live there, you realize that they really are twin cities. You can see them right next to each other. Tema is directly on the Greenwich Meridian, and together Accra and Tema are the center of the world, in that they're the urban agglomeration that's closest to the origin of the Earth, which is the equator of the Greenwich Meridian. But this diagram, so the yellow is sort of the electricity grid across West Africa. The blue is the watershed that feeds into the hydroelectric power supply of Ghana. Red is the transportation routes out of Tema and the port. But what you'll see is that, like many other countries in West Africa, Ghana still very much exports raw materials: gold, aluminum, bauxite, diamonds, manganese, timber, now uranium, agricultural products. Cocoa is a huge sort of cash crop, and imports everything else that's been manufactured. And that extends very much to the production of architecture, which is something we've tried to challenge. Here you see sort of proximity of Accra and Tema. And what's significant about Tema is that Tema was a new town designed from scratch to be an industrial city. So you see on the left housing and on the right-hand side factories. And I sort of started by sort of several-year research into the space, which tried to understand from a very large scale of planning for the entire development of the country of Ghana, to understanding what that city was like in the day-to-day as we live there now. So one thing about Tema is that it's part of this sort of global project of building new towns, which Michel Provost at the New Town Institute in Rotterdam has discussed was very much part of Cold War policy to design and build cities that were either capitalist or sort of according to the logics of the city out of the Soviet Union. And Tema is a city which is really no different. And so they built the city, they built power supply, factories, and then this port in order to extract raw materials and to import finished goods. But when you move around the city, you'll find that there's a lot of transgression, and there's a lot of spaces where people have actually, in a way, found their own way to hack the city. And in particular, what I found extremely interesting is something which I began to call kiosk culture. And that is how you find this very small scale of commercial activity, all the way from peddlers who move around carrying things and selling things, these pop-up shops by the side of the street, and understanding how people create a space to make and sell things within the city when they have very little resources, and understanding how that begins to inform sort of the architecture of the city. And that again includes, for example, people building a bar in the front yard of their house in a city which is designed strictly according to the logics of functional zoning, and the bar is supposed to be in a commercially zoned area, not in your front yard. Or a sort of barbershop hair salon next to your apartments with a kind of carpentry workbench next door, because you need to have a place to generate income and you can't just live in your house. Or these, you find them all across the city, these kiosks that are essentially the shops where you buy everything, sort of colonizing the sidewalks. And you also find a lot of innovation, like this is a barbershop on the left which also repairs and sells computers. And you find sort of these other shops that sell everything from phone credits and sort of phone cards to sort of any kind of sort of goods you could get. And for me, what's very interesting is that when you practice architecture, you find that these are also the workshops where you get things made, where all the metalworking happens, where the carpentry happens, and they're all over literally every neighborhood of the city, and used to literally build the building blocks they use to build architecture. And so when I looked at the city of Tema, I found that the narrative behind the urban design of the city was that, you know, you're going to have this huge industrial city that brings in all this innovation, but really it was at the grassroots, at the sort of low level of the city, where you found that people were improvising and sort of figuring things out very quickly, which also is very much like the Juakali reality that you find in East Africa. So as a way of summarizing this and entering into some of the work, I'll just sort of, I guess you can read it, right? But it says that the manifold of Tema's participation in the figuration of international development policy via historical best practices of town and country planning, located or in some way sourced from the West, encodes a geopolitical mandate within city formation and demands a centralized administrative apparatus charged with managing its development. So in other words, building Tema was an effort to extend Western capitalism into Africa, anchored in a central node of industrialization for national development. But since then, citizens of the city challenged the authority of its centralized planning framework by transgressing its master plan, destabilizing the system of urban planning at its core, and revealing alternative models of urban resistance or retrofit that can reinform efforts to map African urbanization with contemporary modes of living and city making to better integrate customary logics and interclass forms of agency. So one of the ideas here was a project I called Bambots, where we built sort of dozens of these over the last few years. But when we mapped, this is a sort of, long story short, this is a map of the relative construction cost versus what we call the micro-territory or effective micro-territory, how much space you get out of the building, which again, it makes sense that it's sort of exponentially more expensive to build larger sized micro-architecture. And so this was looking at how, if you can use things like bamboo or found recovered materials, can you shift this matrix to actually build larger spaces for less and free up money that you can use largely to connect to sort of the digital economy. So these are some of the kind of conceptual projects that we started with, and building on this idea of bamboo life cycling. So growing the bamboo, which is a weed in Ghana, it sort of just grows on its own, and people are trying to get rid of it, and using that to sort of enable you to self-build temporary architecture, which at its end of life can be recycled as charcoal, as a fuel source, and combat deforestation. So we built, like I said, lots of these little projects, everywhere from planting bamboo forests, different species of bamboos, to lots of different small-scale infrastructures. You saw early on a project we did with students from Stanford, looking at how do you actually bring these solar panels into these spaces. This was a Kiosk Museum that we did in collaboration with the artist and curator Nana Foyata Ayim, which is actually a kind of mobile pop-up kiosk museum that moves around Ghana as a way of bringing sort of arts and culture to communities that are not necessarily going to go to a museum. Or a bamboo dumpster, where what happens when you start developing a project with hundreds of people on a construction site in the middle of the forest and no trash cans, and people still are buying things that are coming in plastic bags, and suddenly you're polluting the environment. You build your own bamboo dumpsters, and we found that this was a way of actually onboarding carpenters. When people show up and they say, I'm a carpenter, or I build out of bamboo, you'd say, okay, build one of these dumpsters. And then you graduate to large-scale projects like this young man, who after sort of part of his apprenticeship got to work with one of the masters in a way, and always we had to start with a physical model, which is the only way to make these things comprehensible. And then these two guys built these structures, usually for a couple $100 in a few days to a week. And here's one where we're sort of experimenting with vaulted structures. I think this one, yeah, it took about 4 or 5 days, and then we covered it with like an old billboard from a sign. So then we looked at sort of smaller scale, and again, lots of sort of experiments, just trying to understand the material and understand how can we connect these things, how can we move towards architecture which can become closer to no cost or extremely low cost. Or here was a pavilion where, I mean, again, when you're working at sort of zero cost budgets, we did this for the launch of Gallery 1957, which is like an art museum in Accra, and we had no time to design it. We basically just went and built it. So we just got a bunch of bamboo, and then we spent sort of a day sort of assembling this thing as a kind of building performance. Or lots of experiments with sort of young people around what we call bamboo robots, where working between sort of digital modeling, even sort of teaching them SketchUp, physical models, trying to understand sort of geometric possibilities. And then again, people without any formal training in making or design whatsoever. These are computer science and engineering students that sort of just made, this was actually a thing where they wanted to be able to have some privacy when they talked on their phone, so they made this sort of dome that could hang from the trees. Or sort of, this is for the Chaliwachi Street Arts Festival. We did a number of installations where we actually camped out in a kind of public square for a week and built a bunch of stuff out of bamboo with the youth, where they then staged these kind of art performances as a sort of stage and sort of learning about bamboo, or prototyping in the forest and then coming into the town, figuring out sort of different ways that you can create sort of, you know, super fast, light, cheap construction, or these sort of experiments where we built sort of mobile bambot, where we actually used it as a sort of playground where kids sort of jumped up and down on it for a weekend, and we could figure out sort of where the joints failed and what was strong and where was more vulnerable. And more recently, sort of this work has culminated in our proposal for MoMA PS1, which I just de-installed like 2 days ago, and that was sort of this idea of a colony of sort of bambots that could invade the PS1 courtyard and kind of create a space of sort of engaging with the public. I think I'm largely out of time, but maybe just I will really quickly just try and link this to one of the later projects which we've been doing. You may be familiar with it. It's called the Agogloshi Makerspace platform. And this was really a sort of intentional project to try and build Ghana's maker community. And you guys are also familiar with the sort of world of the Fab Labs, but you know, this started with a meeting of a bunch of people that were involved in the maker community in Ghana, and we said, you know, how do we scale this up? How do we build this? And sort of out of that, people said, well, you know, let's start with Agogloshi, which is sort of this blight on the sort of image of Ghana, which is this scrapyard in the center of the city. You get these kind of images of young men burning copper wire cables to recover copper. It's super polluted. There's a lot of environmental sort of destruction happening there. Here you see it. There's a sort of slum, old Fadama. The background is the central business district. In the foreground, or the middle ground, is a river, but it's dry season-ish, so it's sort of plastic. And this is what you find in, sort of in this place. People bring all kinds of materials, but despite the sort of narratives of sort of total chaos, it's actually very organized. You know, you have these young guys burning wires and cables in order to recover materials, but we wanted to engage this space. So we started with a sort of roadmap and planning out the project. We actually spent a year doing that and developing this entire sort of theory of change model of how do we conduct an intervention. And then we sort of went into the exploration phase, which is sort of going onto the ground and sort of discovering what it's really like with the people from that community. So this is the recycling that happens in the city of Accra. Even though technically it's banned by the city, these young men go around and collect scrap. and they bring it back to Agabushi, where everything is disassembled and all of the raw materials, or sort of the materials, are sorted by type. You have these small workshops that repair computers, electronics, and resell them. So there's a lot of sort of ingenuity and sort of electronic sort of hacking in these spaces, but also a lot of sort of recycling industries that are actually happening. So people that are recycling plastic and selling it back to factories, and then also all the sort of reuse of sort of scrap materials to make a lot of sort of household products and products for commercial cooking, and also the construction industry. And then we also have our fair share of these sort of massive machines from, pre-World War that are still, making things happen. But you also have things like this where you have people that build welding machines out of the scrap. And these are actually the sort of majority of welding machines that you see people using around the city. So we sort of went through this whole place over another year with young people understanding the needs of people in this community, and sort of mapping that into a physical spatial map of the entire ecosystem, to understand what was happening where, as well as sort of doing an archaeology of the present to sort of understand where is some of the pollution happening, so that in the future, when the whole global community has to try and clean up this site, we can know how to do that, as well as understanding the entire kind of value chain of the scrap industry, from global to local and then back to global again. And then sort of out of that, we then went into sort of multi-year process of co-design, which really started with taking the scrapyard as a laboratory and getting together young people from this sort of informal context, as well as students and recent graduates in STEAM fields, so science, technology, engineering, arts, and mathematics, to go into the scrapyard and mine it for materials and parts and components, and use that to make all kinds of different types of interventions. Some of them more architectural, others more sort of machinery to try and clean up the process of the scrap industry to reduce pollution. And slowly this also began to kind of converge on a larger project, which is this deployable makerspace that we've been developing since, that we call Spacecraft, which I'll just try and show quickly before I wrap up. But yeah, because also they built this drone, which here you can see it flying for the first time. You can see the body was really high tech, some old plastic bottles and some styrofoam. But really fun. And again, part of this is about just bringing people together. It was about 2,000 young people that worked together, half of them from the informal sector and half of them from STEAM fields, from Ghana, Togo, Senegal, Mali, as well as internationally from Europe and the United States. So this project ultimately called Spacecraft. So there's a sort of physical deployable makerspace. There's a set of toolkits which people can customize based on what they want to make. And then there's an app, which is a digital platform that connects makers to find what it is they need to make what it is they want to make. So of course it took us another year to develop the app, went through a whole co-design process with people working in this community, starting with manuals around e-waste so they could understand what the hazardous materials were, but also understanding people's sort of aspirations of their lives, and developing stories that could sort of segue into the actual performance of the app, which was sort of coded and built in Accra for Android. And then here you see sort of user testing it back in the scrapyard in our makerspace. I wish I could click through this more quickly, but I tried to be clever, and so it's on auto sync. But let me just try and take you. All right, I'll just sort of show the sequence and then maybe one last installation in the car. But so really, in a way, the important thing here was going back to this idea of kiosk culture, understanding that it's kind of this distributed site of manufacturing capability all across the city as well as across the country. This is a project that went back to that to say, is there a way that we can create an approach to building the components of architecture that can be done in a semi-standardized way to allow you to build a more robust building with higher degrees of accuracy and precision. So using just the same tools that people have in their roadside shops, we developed sort of the jigs and all the templates that allow people and fixtures to build these equipment within 1 millimeter precision, where you can then assemble the structure with a few people that don't necessarily have any special skills in a couple hours, as well as going through similar processes to develop some of the toolboxes and the other components. And I'm going to just close with So here's the sort of toolboxes they stack to create furniture. And the sort of current developments of this project is, so it's a modular system, so you have these sort of trusses that bolt together, and it has short sections of metal, so you can use offcuts from the building industry, and then we use bolts from old automobiles, and we're also now developing the CNC bot, seal and mounted, so that people can fabricate together with robots. There's sort of internal water filtration and hydroponics for cleaning water and air. And so this is some of the current phase of this development. Again, in this case, it's sort of a makerspace inverted, where it's a micro building that's like a toolbox, where you can check tools out and then they can be distributed around the city. And this past year, we did a technology transfer of the project to Dakar in Senegal, and it was a very good test for the current project of building a sort of visual graphic manual of how to make this, because the team that came from Ghana to Senegal could not speak Wolof or French, and the guys making it in Senegal could not speak English or Twi or Ewe or any of the languages, so there was a total language barrier, but they were able to sort of figure it out, and now this is a kind of pop-up fab lab which moves around Dakar and introduces people sort of in the street to sort of digital fabrication, and recently went to Mauritania, and now I think is maybe back in Senegal. Anyways, I can stop there. We've done a few more installations, but this is in a way, the way we're trying to look at trying to build sort of small scale, incremental sort of modular tool set that people can make in their own communities at very low cost in an incremental kind of way, so that as you accumulate resource, you can expand capabilities and capacity and size and work together with other makers in your ecosystem as a community. So thank you very much.
Well, I've had the privilege of interacting with you extensively over the past couple of weeks, and also yesterday about your work, and I really want to use the time that we have available for other people in the room to be able to engage with you about the practice that you do. But first of all, thank you so much for the incredibly rich presentations and also publications about rethinking the landscape of production. And one of the things that really stuck out for me was this idea of the kind of distributed networks of production that characterize so many of the contexts in which we produce, where the modernist idea of this sort of highly centralized administrative apparatus for producing the built environment has radically exploded across multiple sites, whether one is talking about Johannesburg or Lagos or Kraftema, and Nairobi. So that was something that was really, really interesting, and it speaks to, in my view, a particular kind of post-colonial geography where infrastructures of extraction have kind of framed to a certain extent, but produced this highly fragmented landscape that nevertheless creates openings and opportunities for innovation and creativity. So the idea of transgression is fascinating, but not simply transgression as a refusal of older colonizing technologies, but more as an opportunity to think radically about the present and the future. And then also a very, very important intervention, both by Nifemi and Tabitha, about the idea of heritage, culture, and memory, and how this is so deeply embedded in the way that one produces the work, and also highlighted equally by both DK and Naim, this idea of collaboration and risk, and being able to design across multiple registers that can accommodate and absorb different kinds of capacities and skills. So I don't have any questions, but what I would like to do is to invite questions from the room or a set of engagements. I don't know if you'd like to respond to each other's work as well. Maybe we'll start with that if you'd like to respond to, if there's anything you'd like to respond to from the various presentations or areas of overlap. Naim, why don't you start?
Well, I'm totally fascinated with what DK is up to here, because I can see it as being super relevant in, like, say, Nairobi, for example, and across. And it's how to make something like that travel, how to share what you're doing across the continent as well. Would be amazing, because this is the contemporary toolbox that we need in all of our contexts to make contemporary products. And Nairobi, has tapped into this in its own way in terms of embracing the whole tech industry, and I just think it's super relevant.
I think to add to that as well, it's fascinating because technology is at the forefront of a lot of research and innovation that's going on in Africa, for example, Lagos. And it's fascinating because what you're doing seems like it's open source, and there's very limited open source in Africa. So I just want to find out if there's a way that you're thinking that the information could travel faster across the continent in comparison to just creating physical installations.
So I mean, the short answer is that we're trying. Do I need this thing? Is there a point? I guess this is for the digital world. So we're trying to be faster. I mean, it's a strange thing because, like I said, we've had to actually push back in a way from some of the people that were super interested in the project, because all money has strings attached. And when we're trying to do something which challenges certain kind of global dynamics, it's really weird when you have to battle all of these forces, because everything is tied to resource, but it's complicated. So in a way, we've sort of reverted to kind of bootstrapping it, but we're getting very close. I mean, I think within the next year, the sort of upgraded fabrication manual should go online, which is purely graphic, and then we'll start to add video. So we've had a ton of interest from lots of different countries in Africa. We've presented it in a number of them, and everyone's like, we want to do it, but we don't have the capacity to interface with that. So we're hoping that this can help in some ways. But we're also about to launch the sort of facility in the middle of this kind of ecosystem of makers where people will be making the spacecraft themselves on demand, at which point it'll be sort of fully released into the system.
My question to you is, how do you negotiate local council and not make illegal structures that that it's difficult.
I mean, it is, I guess. So for example, the makerspace that we have that's in the scrapyard, we have an MOU with the government, which technically owns the land, in order to be there, but that's only because we have students from universities internationally showing up there, and if we didn't have that, it would blow up in our face. No one else there has an MOU with the government. But I think the other hack has been, it's about, in a way, putting the process first. So in a way, it's not as if we are building a bunch of these things ourselves and owning them. We're focused on building the open source sort of blueprints that people then make themselves in their own spaces and environments, in which case it's not about us, it's about people that have their own localized negotiation.
Could I make a quick intervention? And it's a question for Tamisa, actually. Which has to do with your statement about South Africa wanting to establish South Africa as a design category. And I mean, we talk about scrapyards and hubs as these infrastructures and spaces for maker culture, but there's also infrastructural questions around how one goes about creating a design category. And I'm wondering how you're negotiating these other kinds of infrastructures that are about, Milan, Venice, and these sort of Euro-American institutions, and what kind of maneuvering one has to engage with in order to craft a space for oneself, maybe similar to an MOU with the local council on a global design platform.
I think what's really interesting, particularly in your presentation, DK, is that a lot of what you're working on, really that kind of conversation happening in South Africa. And actually the South African government has built maker spaces in all of these under-resourced communities. But no one uses them because no one knows how to use them, which is quite interesting. For us, we have a lot of corporate companies that are invested in helping establish South African design as a category brand. And so they invest a lot of money to help us do all of this work, to help with all of these installations, helping also like creating opportunities for all of the designers and makers to collaborate. And another interesting thing that happens a lot in South Africa is we don't have a huge sort of manufacturing industry. But we have shop fitters. And so the shop fitters have become furniture manufacturers, which is really interesting. So we're learning, we're all collaborating, we're all like learning from each other, and we're failing and try again. So it's collaboration.
So I'd like to open up the discussion to the floor if anybody wants to ask our panelists. Hi, Rose.
Yeah, my question is about collaboration actually. What do you mean by collaboration? And what are the, I guess, philosophies that underpin your understanding of collaboration? Maybe previously you saw examples from technology where in tech collaboration can be sorry, can you hear me? Or
Yeah.
did you share your question? Yeah, so I was just talking about how in tech perhaps collaboration can be so, the scale can be at such different sense. You have, tech companies as far as, in Silicon Valley collaborating with, other companies in a different part of the world, with governments in a different part of the world. But in terms of structurally, how you're describing designers and environments, what kind of collaboration do you envision? What is the philosophy or impetus behind that?
So a lot of the designers collaborate, like I said, and that's because we're all on different levels. Okay? So some of the more established designers already have their own workshops. And for others who don't have their own workshops, but maybe have the concept, the ideas of new products. So what will happen is that the guys who don't have the workshop but have the concept will then work with the guys who do have the workshop. And then to add another layer to it, so once the product has been made, we'll then bring in the craft people to apply, their craft, whether it's weaving or beading, to just take the piece to the next level. And when you're working with shop fitters, for example, there has to be, it's a very tricky relationship because when your shop fitter is helping you develop a new product, they also feel a sense of ownership over the product. And then they want to go and start making a product for other designers because we're all using the same manufacturers. So that having that conversation and having negotiating that space is very tricky. But it has to be like a trust relationship. I have to trust that when you help us develop this product, you're not going to go and sell it to another designer. So it's tricky. We're still learning.
The mic is behind you, so maybe we can take 2 questions in a row, and obviously, so we'll take 3 questions so that we can just circulate the mic and then. Yeah.
Maybe this is a question for Naeem first. Just thinking about, you're talking about the fluidity between making and designing. And I think that's something that we all here in the United States have an aspiration to pursue. But these bureaucratic structures and separation of architect and fabricator or architect and contractor, even from a legal standpoint, start to threaten that to a lot of architects. Of course, there are ways around architect design build models, but a lot of architects, I think, are nervous to step into the developers or the contractors' world. So the question, I think, for you would be, do you find that in Nairobi, those bureaucratic structures are starting to creep into the way that you're working, or?
They haven't done yet, and that is, despite all the issues we face, it's a huge freedom. You know, that's really in the West crippling any innovation in the world of design, new values and performance, and which are all very relevant issues, but also things like Revit, you know, is such a kind of constraint, you know, on the freedom that you have as a designer in how you specify. And yeah, I don't know, this is something we are going to have to deal with. We're just in the process of moving and setting up a new workshop in Britain. Probably one of the most bureaucratic kind of red tape. Like, I'm not going to be allowed to make a window. I need to kind of sit, test, to do. We're going to find out. And yet, I think we have to work out ways to break this down. And it's still a great freedom we have. Yeah, it's still a big issue. Yeah. Do you guys see any way around it, in the way that division between architect and maker? Well, I kind of see it in the whole Fab Lab thing, that, you know, that it's maybe a new form of a guild system that, you know, is maybe potentially eroding.
Yeah, I think there are certain architects specifically that are trying to get around that, but then they do it contractually. Like shop architects will then, for large scale stuff, they will actually be subcontracted by a contractor who has been hired to work on the project that they've designed as architects. So they have to form a separate kind of company to then be subcontracted out by the contractor. So they're kind of wearing two hats at once. But they're able to do it because they're very large corporations. If they were smaller, they might not have the resources to be able to set up an additional company and have all the kind of legal staff that would be required to kind of orchestrate that in this particular context.
Can I say that's why you sort of are just discounting the design and build model? Because like we're small in the US, but we're licensed as architects and as general contractors.
Yeah.
So I think it's a totally valid model, and I'm a little bit, maybe we can talk about after, like I'm curious why you're suggesting there's not liability. I think oftentimes architects don't want to do it, and it's arrogance, because it's sort of like, it's like you're an architect and let the contractors do what they do, and so there's a sort of distance, but I don't know, but maybe there's more.
I think that is
I'm going to exercise my authority as unfortunately, we have such limited time that I really want to make sure that we get as much feedback as possible. Okay, if you want to, but you're holding the mic.
All right, so my question was, I thought of this when DK was talking about how you had to build a factory to build by the river, by the bamboo river, and just kind of narratives of what's available and then narratives of lack, and it's not available. And for all of you, I was interested in how you think your projects or your work has either kind of capitalized on big factories that were there, or small factories, or capitalize on like operations that are present and maybe kind of give them space and work to grow with, versus kind of narratives of back where there's absolutely nothing present or nothing required, and you have to do everything from scratch. That's essentially I see a lot in Lagos, like the idea that there's no one who can do something and it's just me and I have to do it. And you also have smaller operations that are looking for things to do. So yeah, if there's a question there.
Can we take
No, it's just following up on that and the response I got, because perhaps the other things to collaboration and taking from mathematics one, the notion that lag is, I'm hearing that there's a way of bridging that through forms of collaboration where when resources and knowledge is sort of seen as inadequate, people who do have those resources and knowledge have a way of collaborating with others who may not have the same skill set. So,
No, I think that's a super interesting issue, and I think we need to work out how to do it across our own continent, because his issues in Ghana are the same issues we have in Nairobi, but they're not Western issues. How to deal with that recycling, this and that, and how people come together, how they negotiate that. And I don't know how that platform, an extension of GSAPP, is something that connects us all, this Pan-African makerspace idea, or makers all over, in whatever form. We all have so much to learn from each other, because seeing everyone's presentations, I mean, that could be played out in any other African city. The DNA is there's some DNA that's relevant in all these cities that's similar with the issues.
I'm sorry, just to stress on an answer to this question. I think for us, what we try to do is we make sure that when we create a product, it's economically viable, not just for the studio, but for the ecosystem. So considering the manufacturers and every single stakeholder involved. And when we design as well, we're designing the mindset of if we're going to batch produce or mass produce. It's important to us because we don't just want to create a product that seems to be art and no one can really touch it or use it or sit on it, etc. But it's important that we put it out there so that we create those viable systems.
Hello everyone, I'm Shiri Machuke. I'd just like to commend everyone on the panel for your work, and it's really insightful that I somehow run into this today. I snuck out of somewhere else coming here. I just had to be here. Don't tell me, but I snuck out. And so I think it's really amazing the work that you're doing. A lot of this thing, we put this in Africa, a lot of people are very, very worried about, oh, it's so far, or it's corrupt, it's this, it's that. But there's so much, it's a designer's utopia, the whole of the continent, to be able to produce there, and I commend you for the work you're doing and navigating everything, right? Okay, so I would like you to touch on the funding. Okay, so how do you fund your work? Is it privately funded? Is it government funded? Yes, we know you could do a lot more there with little, but still being a foreigner, some of you, not necessarily grew up there per se, or coming out from somewhere else to work in a community that you might not know that well. And it's so fragmented, right? So how do you do the funding? Also, are you thinking about scaling your businesses, and how do you want to do that? What do you need to be more successful?
So, me personally, my studio is self-funded. I worked for a very long time, saved up. I basically put everything up to start the studio. Funding for me has been tough. I really don't understand how it works in Africa. I mean, I do a lot of grant submissions, have a lot of conversations, etc. But it seems to always have to go through some sort of European or American organization to get to Africa. So it's tough, and of course we have, I'm going to try to be politically correct now. Like I tried to do, but we have a few issues with, of course, government and corruption in most African states. So, and it's tough because they don't see design as something that can actually create solutions or actually improve policy, which we are looking to dive into in the studio, because we believe that even just introducing a design policy in a place like Accra or Lagos or even Nairobi could actually help infrastructure-wise. So when it comes to urban planning, when it comes to mass production of goods, when it comes to actually solving healthcare issues. It's extremely, extremely important. Another thing is that even for me, I started off with furniture for the studio because it was affordable. I've done product design for healthcare. I've done product design for mobile phone, smartphone companies. But of course, setting up my own smartphone company would be kind of stupid because cost-wise, etc., and overheads. So I started off with furniture just as a stage to figure out a way to carry out research on the manufacturing processes actually available and educating these manufacturers on how to exploit the processes available without changing assembly lines. So that's, if that answers your question.
Our work is funded by what we make. It's very simple. There is no other resource. I think we try, what we do is say architecture work is if you are working as the designer as a whole and then you can take away components that you are making, there's an efficiency there for the client and for yourself because what you're drawing is what you're going to make from the outset is what you draw is, you know, you can make it and you're cutting out that third party who needs to redraw it, and so you're doing the work of several people. But the challenge there is costing correctly so that you benefit from that efficiency. That's really difficult. Yeah.
So like Nani, our work is also funded by the work itself, because we sell products, we sell furniture and lighting products. So that's the one way we will scale our business, sell more. And we're lucky in that the South African government does have policies in place that encourage companies to procure from local designers, local manufacturers, and they get tax breaks. And, so that's one way the policy framework is in place to help propel South African designers, South African manufacturing. They don't always. They don't always. In reality, you do have to negotiate quite a bit, but the framework is there.
You've been waiting a long time to ask a question.
I've just been very happy to listen. So I should start by caveating that I don't know that much about the socioeconomic situations of the various cities, so I apologize if I mischaracterize anything. But it seems to me that what is common across the presentations is about creativity and the development of original process in response to constraint and to an absence of resources, whether it's economic or infrastructure. And I'm just curious, in the presence of perhaps economic development or the smoothing and provisioning of more infrastructure, how would you then negotiate with the fact that these niches and these spaces that are now present might disappear? Like, for example, with Zulu basketry, do you then support these improved infrastructure because it might lead to, easier ways to produce your goods, or do you find that that might actually constrain the processes that you are developing today?
I think, one of the problems with such small businesses that we can't control this process, but it's so apparent how the growth of in Kenya, like Chinese infrastructure has really taken over and correlated with the extraction of resources, and it's in even the 15 years that I've been working there, there is no more wood available in Kenya. There isn't of any. Our offcuts that we cut 10 years ago is better than and stacked is better than anything we can buy today, and that kind of, it's so real that one way kind of route of what's happening with our resources. And I don't know how you fight that. I don't know how you fight the flood of cheap UPVC windows in the market. And I don't know what to do other than you keep producing your stuff locally and building an economy around making locally. Because if we don't, as designers, do that, that industry does. And we've got to fight for it. Yeah.
I think for me, I think one thing that I'm also looking to investigate in is to figure out how to use old age technology to solve modern day problems. So figuring out how to pair those two so that crafts doesn't die in Africa, but what are the sorts of solutions that we can come up with, educating these craftspeople on like the modern day issues that's sort of around us and designing around that as well.
Yeah, as architects, it's our responsibility to specify, it's our choice, to clients often don't know. They want, no, use something else. We have the power to kind of direct things slightly.
You guys talked about how the product is usually the thing that funds the business, and you also mentioned like the first stool that you had when you first put it out, it kind of was slow to start selling. What for all of you, I guess, what is your strategy when you make a product and there's like no immediate market for it? How do you get people interested in the product when it wasn't like a commission, but you just made it out of interest and you're trying to get out of it?
Okay. So what I learned from that story was to actually listen to the market, and when you're designing around what's available as well, you have to sort of map out the ecosystem and figure out what people want and what people want to use. So one of the most successful products that I showed was the table, was actually the collapsible table. And that's successful because we actually sat down and had conversations with potential users, figuring out exactly what they want and what their needs are, aspirations, and designing around that, and carrying them along the design process. So figuring all of that out, I realized that you could approach it in both ways. So with the store, where it's like we're approaching a factory, creating economical viability for them, and then they just finding out, okay, you know what, we can actually push this store. Or you go out, get your hands dirty, speak to a bunch of people who you potentially think might want to use the product, and figure out what the issues are and what problems you need to solve every time. Yeah.
I think as designers, we're always such martyrs. We work so hard for nothing, but we don't work for free. I mean, basically, yeah. So, like, we're not artists. We need the client, and we need free. And we need to push for it for free, because otherwise you go around in circles, overproducing and in a vague world. That's the big challenge. Don't work for free and work, Very, very rarely do we kind of like design and when we started up, we would be doing that a lot. But I don't have a desire to make a chair for the sake of making it. There's so many chairs in the world. And very good chairs that can be made way cheaper in Germany than I can make them. Why am I designing a new chair? For what? Is there a good reason? Do we need it? Is there a reason it can't be imported? Do I still have to make that chair? Okay, I'll make you a chair.
For us, there's a lot of development that's happening in South Africa, so hotels, restaurants, game lodges, etc., etc. So what we do is we target interior designers and architects, find out, we get a sense of what their style is, and then we create this hyper-real renderings. Then we sell them the rendering. And if they love it, they'll give us money, we make the thing.
Okay, I think this is a good note to close on. Again, thank you so much to Josh, to Lana, GSAPP for collaborating on this event and hosting all of us so graciously.